Caleb Dawson had not spoken a woman's name out loud in 3 years. Not since he carried his wife's body down the mountain in the dead of winter and buried her beneath the only oak tree she ever loved. He had stopped expecting anything from life after that. He had stopped wanting. So when the stagecoach broke down at the edge of his property on a blazing summer afternoon, and a woman stepped out with blood on her hands and terror in her eyes, Caleb did the one thing no one expected. He stepped forward. If this story already has your heart, hit that subscribe button right now and drop the name of your city in the comments below. I want to see just how far this story travels. Now, let's get into it. The summer of 1884 came hard to the Montana high country. The kind of summer that cracked the earth open and baked the grass down to pale yellow straw. The kind that made cattle restless and men short-tempered, and the air above the ridgeline shimmer like a fever dream. Caleb Dawson had been up since before dawn mending the north fence line where 3 posts had rotted through over winter. Sweat ran down the back of his neck and soaked through his shirt before the sun was even fully up. He worked without stopping. He always worked without stopping. Stopping meant thinking. Thinking meant remembering. And Caleb Dawson had made a private agreement with himself 3 years ago that remembering was a luxury he could no longer afford. He heard the stagecoach before he saw it, the crack of a wheel giving way, the hard lurch of the coach listing sideways. The driver's shouted curse carrying clear across the dry summer air. Caleb straightened. He pushed his hat back and looked toward the road. The coach had come to a dead stop about 200 yards from the property line. One rear wheel had snapped clean off the axle. The horses were stamping and blowing tangled in their traces. He should have left it alone. The road wasn't his responsibility. The coach wasn't his problem. He had 12 things on his list before noon and not a minute to spare on somebody else's trouble. He picked up his tools and walked toward the road anyway. There were 2 passengers. An older woman with a carpet bag pressed to her chest, sitting on a rock beside the disabled coach and fanning herself with a folded newspaper. And then the other one. She was standing apart from the coach maybe 20 feet with her back to the road and her face turned toward the mountains. She was wearing a traveling dress that had once been fine deep green good fabric, but it was dusty now and torn at the hem. Her dark hair had come half loose from its pins. One of her hands was wrapped in a cloth that had soaked through with blood. She didn't move when Caleb approached. She didn't turn around. She just stood there, looking at the mountains like she was trying to memorize them. "Ma'am," he said. She turned then, and Caleb saw her face. She was younger than he'd expected, late 20s maybe. High cheekbones, dark eyes that were completely dry, which struck him as wrong, given the blood on her hand and the wrecked coach, and the middle-of-nowhere situation she was currently standing in. Most women would have been crying. This one looked like she had already cried everything she had and come out the other side of it into something harder. "Are you hurt?" he asked. She looked down at her hand like she'd forgotten about it. "The window broke when the wheel gave. Glass. It's not deep." "Let me see." She hesitated. Just a fraction of a second, barely enough to notice. Then she held out her hand. He unwrapped the cloth. It was a clean cut about 2 inches long across the heel of her palm. Bleeding steadily, but not dangerously. He pressed the cloth back against it and held pressure. "You got somewhere to be?" he asked. She looked at him, then really looked at him like she was trying to figure out if he was someone she could afford to answer honestly. "I was headed to Millhaven," she said. "That's another 40 miles west." "I know. This coach isn't moving today. Probably not tomorrow either, depending on whether Hank Burrows has a spare axle at his livery." He glanced toward the older woman on the rock. "You traveling with family?" "No, I don't know her. We were just on the same coach." Caleb looked back at the mountains, then at the woman's hand, then at the long empty road stretching in both directions. He didn't want to ask the next question. He asked it anyway. "Where are you coming from?" Something moved across her face. Not fear exactly. More like calculation. The look of a person deciding how much truth was safe to spend. "East," she said. "That was all. Just east." Caleb let it go. He had his own things he didn't talk about. He understood the currency of unspoken history. "My ranch is about a quarter-mile up that ridge," he said. "I've got clean bandages, water, food if you need it. The driver's going to need a few hours to sort out what he can. You're welcome to wait there." She studied him the way you'd study a contract before signing it, checking for hidden clauses. "Why?" she asked. The question caught him sideways. Most people just said thank you and followed. This one wanted to know the reason first. "Because it's 102 degrees, he said, "and you've got blood running down your wrist." She looked at her hand. She looked at him. Then she said, "All right." Her name was Clara Whitmore. She told him that much while he bandaged her hand at the kitchen table. She didn't offer anything else, and he didn't push. He put water on to boil and found the last of the bread and some dried venison and set it in front of her without ceremony. She ate like someone who hadn't eaten since morning. Careful at first, then steadily, then with the focused urgency of a person who'd been running on fear and not much else. Caleb sat across from her and drank his coffee and didn't stare. The house was quiet. It was always quiet now. That was the part he'd gotten used to. The quiet used to have a shape to it, his wife's voice moving through the rooms, her laugh carrying from the kitchen, the sound of her singing under her breath when she thought he wasn't near enough to hear. After she died, the quiet changed. It became empty instead of full. He'd learned to live inside the empty quiet. He didn't like it, but he'd learned it. Clara looked around the kitchen. Her eyes moved over everything, the shelves, the cook stove, the account ledger lying open on the counter, the stack of unpaid invoices beside it. "You run this place alone?" she asked. "I've got one hand. Emmett. He's out in the south pasture today." "How many head of cattle?" Caleb set down his coffee cup. "Excuse me. Cattle. How many head?" He looked at her. 180, give or take. Why? She nodded like she was filing that away somewhere. Her eyes went to the ledger again. "That ledger, is that your ranch accounts?" "It is." "Those figures on the top line, that's your supply cost from Harmon's store." Caleb stared at her. "How'd you read that from here?" "I didn't." She met his eyes. "But you've got an invoice on top of that stack that says Harmon's General dated June, and the number on it is almost twice what a ranch this size should be paying for summer supply. I noticed when I sat down." A long silence opened up between them. "You know ranch accounting," he said. "I know accounting," she said simply. "My father owns a shipping business. I kept his books from the time I was 16 until—" She stopped, pressed her lips together, started again. "I know numbers." Caleb looked at the invoice. He'd been uneasy about it himself. Harmon had explained it away. Rising cost supply shortages, a longer freight haul from the Eastern Rail. It had sounded plausible enough, and Caleb wasn't a man who argued over money, because arguing over money meant having a conversation, and having a conversation with Hector, Harmon, always felt like trying to hold water in cupped hands. "I'd have to look at the actual ledger," Clara said. "But if you want me to, I can tell you within about 20 minutes whether you're being charged fairly." "You've been in this house for 20 minutes, he said. "And your supply costs are too high," she said. "That much I can tell you without opening anything." Caleb studied her. She looked back at him without flinching. No apology in her eyes, no backing down. Just patient, clear certainty. "All right," he said, and slid the ledger across the table. She found 4 discrepancies in the first pass, not mistakes. Discrepancies, and there was a difference, as she pointed out with the calm precision of someone who had been doing this long enough to know the difference between a man who made errors and a man who made choices. "This feed delivery in April," she said, turning the ledger so he could see. "You signed for 4,200 pounds. The invoice charges for 4,800. You're paying for 600 pounds of feed you never received." Caleb looked at the numbers. He looked at them for a long time. 600 pounds, he said. "At current prices, that's about $11. And that's just April. There's a similar gap in February and one in March." She turned back a page. "And this your cattle count. You said 180. This entry here shows you paid graze fees to the county for 210. Who filed that count? Harmon handles the county paperwork. Has since my wife? He stopped. Has for the last few years. Clara said nothing. She just looked at the numbers and let them speak for themselves. Caleb stood up and walked to the window. Outside, the summer heat pressed down on the pasture and the mountains sat in the distance, solid and permanent and unimpressed. He'd trusted Hector Harmon for 3 years. The man had been friendly when Caleb needed friendly. Had handled things when Caleb didn't have the will to handle them himself. Had been, if he was honest about it, one of the only people in Millhaven who hadn't looked at Caleb like he was something broken after Eleanor died. How much, he said without turning around. Total. He heard the soft sound of her turning pages. Over the last 2 years, best estimate somewhere between $80 and $120 overcharged. Depending on whether the cattle count discrepancy affects your tax assessment, which I'd want to verify before saying for certain. Caleb turned around. $100. $100 that he'd worked himself near to the bone for. That he'd gotten up before dawn for and stayed out past dark for. That he'd skipped town twice because he couldn't justify the expense of the livery while he was there. That's not all, Clara said. Her voice had gone quieter. He watched her face. She had found something, and it was worse than the rest. Tell me, he said. She looked up from the ledger. This notation here, J.W. Holdings quarterly payment. Do you know what that is? That's the note on the East pasture land. I took out a land loan 3 years ago when... He stopped again. He kept stopping in the same place. When Eleanor died, he'd meant to say, when Eleanor died, and I couldn't function for 6 months, and the ranch got behind and I had to borrow against the East pasture to keep the whole thing from going under. I borrowed against a piece of land. 40 acres on the east side. The note's through a land company out of Helena. J.W. Holdings, Clara said. That's right. Caleb! She said his name for the first time, and something in the way she said it made him go still. J.W. Holdings isn't registered in Helena. I know that company. My father did business with the man who runs it. His name is Joseph Whitfield. He's a land speculator. He files fraudulent notes, waits for the borrower to fall behind, then seizes the property under terms that were never fully disclosed in the original agreement. The kitchen was very quiet. He's been doing it across 3 territories for the last 8 years, she said. My father worked with him twice. I handled the accounts. I know exactly how he structures these loans because I'm the one who wrote the letters. Caleb sat back down. The weight of it was too much to hold standing up. You're telling me I might not actually own the East pasture. I'm telling you that if this loan is structured the way Whitfield's other loans are structured, you have about 6 months before he moves to collect. And when he collects, he doesn't take just the collateral. He takes everything adjacent that he can argue was necessary security. She paused. That would be most of your ranch, Caleb. He stared at the table. He stared at the numbers on the page. He stared at the neat, steady handwriting of this woman he'd known for less than 2 hours, who had just dismantled the last thing he had left to hold on to. Why are you telling me this? He said. Because it's true. You don't know me. No, she said. But I know Whitfield, and I know what happens to men who find out too late. Something moved behind her eyes, something old and heavy. I've seen it happen. I didn't stop it when I could have. I'm stopping it now, Rinchardant. By the time the stagecoach driver appeared at the door to say the coach wouldn't be moving until the following morning, Clara had produced a 3-page summary of Caleb's financial situation in handwriting so precise it looked like it had been typeset. Caleb stood in the doorway and looked at the driver and then back at Clara. There's a spare room, he said. Clean sheets, if you need to stay the night. Clara looked at the ledger. She looked at the stack of papers she hadn't finished going through. She looked at the 3 pages of careful notes she'd made in the margins. I'll need your last 2 years of county tax records, she said, and any correspondence you have from J.W. Holdings. I've got a box of correspondence in the back room I never opened, he said. Her jaw tightened. Go get it. He went and got it. Emmett came in from the south pasture at sundown and stopped dead in the kitchen doorway when he saw a woman at the table surrounded by papers. He looked at Caleb. He looked at Clara. He looked at the papers. He looked back at Caleb with an expression that contained approximately 40 separate questions. "This is Clara Whitmore," Caleb said. "She's staying the night. The coach broke down." "Ma'am," Emmett said carefully. "Emmett," Clara said without looking up from the documents. "You take the cattle out to the east pasture on Thursday mornings." Emmett blinked. Yes, ma'am. Thursdays and sometimes Mondays depending on, how many head do you move? All of them or near enough? 170, 180. Never 210. Emmett scratched the back of his neck. 210, no ma'am. We ain't had 210 head since the winter of '81. Clara wrote something down. "Thank you, Emmett. That's what I needed." Emmett looked at Caleb again. "She's fixing the accounts," Caleb said. Emmett nodded slowly. "All right then." He went to wash up for supper without another word, because Emmett had been working for Caleb long enough to know when a thing had already been decided. After supper, after Emmett had gone to his bunk and the dishes were cleared and the lamp was burning low, Clara sat at the table and looked at the wall for a long moment. Then she said without turning around, "My father sent a man after me. That's why I was on the coach." Caleb sat very still. "I left Chicago 2 weeks ago," she said. "I had enough money for the coach fare and a little more. I was going to Millhaven because I have a letter of introduction to the schoolhouse there. I know enough to teach. I thought if I could get a position before anyone found me." She stopped. "His name is Douglas. The man my father sent. He's good at finding people. He was 2 days behind me when I left St. Louis. He might be less than that now." "What does your father want with you?" Caleb said. She was quiet for a moment. "He made a business arrangement with a man named Whitmore Gale. Railroad money. Gale needed a wife with good family name, and my father needed access to Gale's freight contracts." She said it flat and clean the way you describe a business transaction. "I was the terms of the deal." "He sold you," Caleb said. "He arranged me," she said. "He'd call it something more civilized than selling." "What would you call it?" She looked at him then, and in the lamplight, her eyes were very dark and very steady. "I'd call it the reason I'm sitting in a stranger's kitchen at 9 o'clock at night going through his land records instead of planning a wedding I never agreed to." Caleb looked at the papers on the table. He looked at his hands big and scarred from a decade of ranch work. He thought about the box of mail he'd never opened. He thought about Hector Harmon's smile. "You can stay," he said, "until we sort out the Whitfield situation. After that—" He stopped. "After that, I'll go to Millhaven," she said. "Right." A silence passed between them. Outside, a coyote called somewhere up on the ridge, and the horses shifted in the barn. "Caleb," she said. "Yeah, you should know something." She gathered the papers into a neat stack. "When I left Chicago, I left the only copy of the original Whitfield loan documents. The ones that show the actual terms he filed with the county versus the terms he showed you. My father has those documents. He's worked with Whitfield." She met his eyes. "If my father finds me before we sort this out, you lose the leverage." Caleb processed that for a moment. "So we've got a deadline," he said. "We've got a deadline," she said. He nodded. He reached out and pulled the lamp a little closer to the edge of the table so the light fell better on the papers. "Then let's keep working," he said. And Clara Whitmore, who had spent 2 weeks running and 2 hours at a kitchen table tearing apart a stranger's financial ruin, reached for the next document in the stack and got back to work. Neither of them noticed, right then, the exact moment the word we had stopped being strange. The morning after Clara spread those documents across Caleb's kitchen table, Hector Harmon rode up to Dawson Ridge Ranch at 7:15 in the morning, like he owned the road and everything on either side of it. Caleb heard the hoofbeats from the barn where he was feeding the horses. He stepped out and saw Harmon pulling up with that particular kind of easy confidence that men wear when they've never once been told no by anyone who mattered. Harmon was a big man, well-fed with a silver watch chain across his vest that caught the early morning light. He smiled when he saw Caleb. He always smiled. That was the thing about Harmon. He smiled the way a trap smiles, which is to say it didn't move and it didn't mean anything, and you only understood what it really was after your foot was already in it. "Morning, Dawson," Harmon said, swinging down from his horse. "Heard you had a stagecoach breakdown out on the South Road yesterday." "Word travels," Caleb said. "Small county." Harmon glanced toward the house. "Also heard there was a woman passenger. Thought I'd ride out, make sure everything was all right. Being neighborly." Caleb looked at him. "Everything's fine." "Glad to hear it." Harmon didn't move toward his horse. "She's still here." "Why would that matter to you?" Harmon shrugged, easy and slow. "Just making conversation, Caleb. You know me." "I do," Caleb said. "Come to think of it, that's why I'm about to ask you something. Those feed deliveries in February, March, and April. You process those invoices through your store." Something shifted in Harmon's face. So small you'd miss it if you weren't looking for it. Caleb was looking for it. "Sure did," Harmon said. "Standard orders. Why?" "Because I signed for £4,200 in April and the invoice billed me for $4,800. Silence. 1 beat. 2. Harmon laughed. It came out easy and practiced. "Caleb, you know how these freight tallies work. There's always some variance in the weighing. 600 pounds of variance. I'd have to look at the paperwork." "I've already looked at the paperwork," Caleb said. "All of it, going back 2 years. Harmon stopped smiling. The two men stood in the summer heat and looked at each other, and whatever fiction of neighborliness had existed between them for 3 years evaporated right there in the dust between the barn and the fence. "Someone's been filling your head with ideas," Harmon said. His voice had changed. Still smooth, but the warmth was gone out of it. "Someone's been filling my invoices with numbers that don't match my deliveries," Caleb said. "I reckon those are different problems." Harmon's eyes went to the house again. This time he didn't pretend it was casual. "That woman," he said. "You should go Hector." "Caleb." "Now." Harmon looked at him for a long moment. Then he gathered up his reins and swung back into the saddle with the deliberate slowness of a man who wants you to know he's choosing to leave, not being made to. "You ought to be careful," Harmon said from the saddle. "Stranger shows up on your property, fills your head with accusations you don't know a thing about her." "I know enough," Caleb said. Harmon rode out without another word. Caleb watched him go until the dust settled back onto the road. Then he walked back into the house and found Clara standing at the kitchen window with her arms crossed and her jaw set, like she'd been watching the whole thing. "He'll go straight to Whitfield," she said. "I know." "That changes our timeline." "How much?" She turned from the window. "We needed 6 months. We might have 6 weeks. Caleb pulled out a chair and sat down. "Then tell me what we need to do first." Clara sat across from him, reached for the papers she'd organized the night before, and got to work. That was the morning everything between them shifted, not toward something soft or romantic, not yet, but toward something that felt like standing on the same side of a wall for the first time. Trust wasn't the right word for it. Trust implied a choice freely made with plenty of time to consider. This was different. This was two people who'd run out of options separately and stumbled into having one option together, and finding that option was better than either of them had expected. Emmett came in from morning chores and watched them at the table for a moment. He poured himself coffee and leaned against the counter. "Harmon rode out pretty fast," he said. "We had a conversation," Caleb said. "Looked like a short one." It was. Emmett drank his coffee. He looked at the papers spread between Caleb and Clara. "You want me to ride to the county office in Brixton today? Check on that land filing you mentioned last night." Clara looked up. "You told him. He works this land," Caleb said. "He has a right to know what might happen to it." Something moved through Clara's expression surprise, and something underneath the surprise that looked like it might be respect, though she didn't let it sit on her face long enough to confirm. Yes, she told Emmett. I need the original filing for JW Holdings land note number. She checked her notes. 47-18. Filed March of '82. If you can get a copy of the full document, not just the summary page, that's what I need. Yes, ma'am. Emmett set down his cup. Brixton's 2 hours each way. I'll be back by supper time. Emmett, Clara said before he reached the door. He turned. Don't tell anyone what you're looking for or why. Just say you're verifying a routine filing. Emmett looked at Caleb. She's right, Caleb said. Emmett nodded once, put his hat on, and left. Clara watched the door close behind him. He's loyal to you, she said. He's worked this ranch for 8 years. Not everyone who works for a man is loyal to him. She said it quiet and flat, like she was reading from something she'd memorized the hard way. Caleb looked at her. She was already back to the papers. He let it go. The hours that followed had a particular rhythm to them. Clara working through documents with a focused efficiency that was almost startling to watch Caleb answering her questions when she had them and staying out of her way when she didn't. She had a way of thinking out loud that wasn't really inviting conversation so much as organizing her own thoughts, and Caleb found himself listening to the sound of it, the way he used to listen to the creek running behind the barn in spring. Just present, not needing to respond. Around mid-morning, she set her pen down and said, "Your wife." Caleb went still. "You don't have to," she started. "Eleanor," he said. "Her name was Eleanor." Clara waited. "She died in the winter of '81. Fever came on fast. We were snowed in, and the doctor couldn't get through." He looked at his hands. "She was gone in 4 days." "I'm sorry. 3 years ago, I'd have told you that's when the ranch started falling behind. The real answer is, that's when I stopped watching it closely enough. Harmon stepped in and offered to handle the supply orders and county paperwork, and I let him because—" He stopped. "Because I didn't care what happened to anything for a while." Clara was quiet for a moment. "My mother died when I was 12, she said. My father didn't grieve. He worked. He made money. He made more money. And somewhere in the making of it, the rest of us became line items in a ledger." She looked down at the papers. "I've thought sometimes that grief makes some people go cold, and some people go hollow. You went hollow for a while. My father went cold. I'm not sure which is worse." Caleb looked at her. It was the most she'd said about herself since she arrived, and it sat in the room differently than the account figures and land documents. More weight to it. More truth. "What made you leave?" he said. "Specifically, what was the moment?" She was quiet long enough that he thought she wasn't going to answer. "Gail came to dinner," she said finally. "The man my father arranged me for. He sat across the table from me and spent the entire evening talking to my father about freight rates and didn't address a single word directly to me except once at the end when he looked at me and said—" She paused. "Your father tells me you're adequate with numbers. You can keep the household accounts." Her voice didn't change. It stayed even and steady. Adequate. Like I was a piece of equipment he was reviewing the specifications of. "And your father?" He smiled and said I was more than adequate. She picked up her pen. "That was a Thursday. I left Sunday morning before anyone was awake." Caleb said nothing. There wasn't anything useful to say, and he'd learned a long time ago that the people who rushed to fill silence usually did it for themselves, not for the person they were supposedly comforting. Clara seemed to understand this because she didn't seem to need him to say anything. She just went back to work, and the silence between them settled into something that wasn't uncomfortable at all. That should have told him something. He didn't know it yet. It was mid-afternoon when she found the second set of books. She'd been working through the unopened correspondence box, the one Caleb brought in from the back room, the night before, pulling each letter out, reading it, sorting it into piles. Most of it was routine. Some of it was late billing notices he'd never responded to, which explained a few of the collection notices in the other pile. And then she pulled out a letter with a Helena postmark and a return address of JW Holdings, and she read it once, read it twice, and then set it flat on the table in front of her. "Caleb," she said. He was across the room, recoiling a length of rope. The way she said his name stopped him. He came to the table and read the letter. It was dated 14 months ago. It was from a man named Gerald Pruitt, identifying himself as an associate of JW Holdings, and it outlined in very careful legal language that the original land note Caleb had signed in 1882 contained what Pruitt called an acceleration clause language that allowed the note holder to call the full remaining balance due within 90 days' notice under certain conditions. One of those conditions, described in Clause 7 of the original document, was what Pruitt called material change in property management structure. The letter informed Caleb that his recent hire of a new ranch hand, meaning Emmett, who Caleb had brought on after Eleanor died, constituted a material change, and that JW Holdings was therefore reserving the right to invoke the acceleration clause at a time of their choosing. Caleb read it twice. "This was sent 14 months ago," he said. "Yes." "I never opened it." "No." He set the letter down carefully. "Does this mean they can call the loan now? Anytime they want?" "They gave notice 14 months ago," Clara said. Her voice was very controlled. "The clause requires 90 days between notice and invocation. They've waited much longer than that. Which means they can move whenever they're ready. Which means they've been waiting," she said, "holding this, letting the interest accumulate, letting the situation develop." She looked at him. "Caleb, this isn't a loan that went sideways. This was designed to take this land. The acceleration clause, the fraudulent fee overcharges draining your cash reserves so you can't pay off the balance early. The county grazing filings inflating your reported herd size to increase your tax exposure. All of it is coordinated. Someone has been orchestrating this from the beginning." "Harmon," Caleb said. "Harmon is a mechanism," Clara said. "He's not the architect. Someone put him in place. Someone who knew you'd lose your wife and lose your focus and need someone to handle things." She looked at the letter again. "Do you know anyone in Helena? Anyone with money who might want this specific piece of land?" Caleb was quiet for a long time. "There's a man," he said slowly. "Name of Aldrich, Warren Aldrich. He approached me about 4 years ago before Eleanor got sick about buying the east pasture. Said he wanted to expand his grazing territory. I told him no. The east pasture is the best water access on the property. Without it, the whole ranch is worth half. And after Eleanor died, he came back once, 6 months after, offered more money." Caleb's voice had gone flat. "I told him no again. I wasn't in a condition to make good decisions, but I knew enough to say no to that." "And then 6 months after that," Clara said, "you took out a loan through JW Holdings." The kitchen went very quiet. "Aldrich," Caleb said. "I'd want to verify it," Clara said. "But yes, JW Holdings, Joseph Whitfield, he works with men like Aldrich. He's the mechanism for taking land that can't be purchased outright." She straightened the letter on the table. "Your land couldn't be bought. So someone arranged for it to be taken." Caleb sat down. The weight of 3 years settled onto him all at once. 3 years of working himself to nothing. 3 years of watching the margins get tighter. 3 years of thinking it was his own fault, his own grief, his own failure to keep up. And underneath all of it, someone had been pulling at strings he couldn't see. "What do we do?" he said. Clara folded her hands on the table. "We need the original loan document, the one you signed in 82. Do you have your copy? Should be in that box." She went through the remaining letters quickly, efficiently. Near the bottom, she found an envelope with the JW Holdings letterhead, and inside it was a 4-page document, thin paper, dense print, the loan agreement. She read it like a woman who'd read documents like this before. Her eyes moved fast, but she didn't miss anything. When she got to page 3, she stopped. "There it is," she said. "Clause 7. Clause 7. She turned the document so he could see. "And below it, Clause 8. Look at the language." He leaned in and read. Clause 8 said that in the event of foreclosure, all property contiguous to the original collateral would be assessed as part of the recovery proceeding, if the note holder could demonstrate the contiguous property had been used as operational support for the collateral during the loan term. Everything adjacent, Caleb said. Everything adjacent, Clara confirmed. The east pasture, the house, the barn, the north grazing land. All of it. Emmett's quarters. Everything on this ridge. Caleb stood up. He walked to the window and stood there with his back to Clara and his hand flat on the wall beside the frame, and he breathed. In through his nose, out through his mouth, slow and deliberate, the way he'd taught himself to breathe in the bad months after Eleanor died, when the panic came and there was nothing to do but hold on to air and wait for it to pass. "I'm going to lose everything," he said. It wasn't a question. "Not if we move first," Clara said. He turned around. Her eyes were steady. Her hands were steady. She'd been running for 2 weeks, and finding out her father's business had helped destroy a man's life, and she was sitting there steady as a fence post in solid ground. "There's a circuit court judge who travels through this territory," she said. "His name is Harlan Mace. I know that name because my father tried to bribe him once, and Mace refused, and my father came home furious and called him the most inconvenient, honest man in 3 territories. She almost smiled. It didn't quite make it all the way to her mouth. "He's due in Brixton in 3 weeks for the summer court session. If we can get these documents in front of him, the original loan, the fraudulent fee records, evidence of the coordinated scheme, a judge like Mace doesn't let that go quietly." 3 weeks, Caleb said. 3 weeks to build the case, 1 filing, 1 hearing. And if Whitfield moves before 3 weeks, then we fight that when it happens. She stood up. "But Caleb, you have something Whitfield didn't expect you to have." "What's that?" She looked at him across the kitchen table, across the spread of documents that laid out 3 years of careful, quiet theft. "Evidence," she said, "and someone who knows how to read it." He looked at her. This woman who'd come off a broken-down stagecoach 24 hours ago with blood on her hand and a man following behind her, and a father who'd sold her future like a freight contract. Who'd sat in his kitchen and dismantled his crisis with the same practical precision she probably brought to everything she did. Who'd told him her own hardest truth without asking for sympathy and expected nothing from him except honesty in return. "Why are you doing this?" he said. "You could keep moving. You were going to Millhaven. You don't owe me anything." Clara looked at the papers. She looked at the window. She looked at him. "Because I spent 4 years processing paperwork for men like Whitfield and Aldrich, and I watched what they did to people, and I told myself it wasn't my doing because I only handled the numbers." Her voice was very quiet. "That's not good enough anymore. It stopped being good enough about 6 months before I got on that coach." Caleb was quiet for a long moment. "All right," he said. "All right," she said. When Emmett rode back in at supper time, with the full land filing from the Brixton County office, he found Caleb and Clara still at the kitchen table. 3 days ago, Caleb couldn't have told you the last time he'd sat at that table past noon. Now he couldn't have said how many hours had passed because they'd stopped feeling like hours and started feeling like something that had shape and direction and purpose. Emmett laid the filing on the table and pointed to a name at the bottom of the form. The signatory for J.W. Holdings on the original county filing was not Joseph Whitfield. It was not Gerald Pruitt. It was a name none of them expected. It was Hector Harmon. Clara looked at the document. Then she looked at Caleb. Then she said very quietly, "He's not just a mechanism. He's a partner." And Caleb said nothing for a moment, because he was remembering Harmon at Eleanor's graveside, hat in hand, eyes down, offering to help with the paperwork, offering to take care of things. Being so kind about it, being so patient. "He waited," Caleb said. "He stood at my wife's grave, and he waited." The rage that moved through him then was the quiet kind. The kind that doesn't yell and doesn't shake. The kind that settles in the chest like iron and stays there and doesn't move and doesn't burn out. He looked at Clara. "We're going to Brixton," he said. "We're going to Judge Mace. And we're going to take every piece of paper in that box, and we're going to end this. Clara looked at him across the papers and the lamp and the 3 years of theft laid out between them. "Yes," she said, "we are." Outside on the ridge, the summer wind came down off the mountains and moved through the dry grass, and neither of them heard it because they were already planning. They left for Brixton before sunrise. Caleb had the documents wrapped in oilcloth and tucked inside his saddlebag, and Clara had spent the last hour of the night before making 2 copies of the most critical pages in her careful handwriting, because she understood that original documents had a way of disappearing when the men who needed them to disappear had money and time and motivation. She gave 1 copy to Emmett, with instructions to hide it somewhere on the property that wasn't the house. She kept the other inside her traveling bag, pressed flat between the pages of the only book she'd brought from Chicago. Emmett watched them ride out with an expression that was trying hard to look casual and not quite managing it. "I'll be here," he said, which was his way of saying he understood the situation and wasn't going anywhere and would protect what needed protecting. "I know," Caleb said. They rode without talking for the first hour. The road to Brixton ran through open country, and the summer morning came in fast and bright and hot, and Clara rode with her back straight and her eyes forward, like a woman who'd made peace with the decision she was riding toward. Caleb watched her from the corner of his eye occasionally, and thought that whatever fear she carried it well. It didn't slow her down. It didn't make her loud. It just sat in her somewhere, and she moved around it. "You ride well," he said, which was as close as he usually got to a compliment. "My mother rode," she said. "She taught me before she died. My father sold the horses after, said they were an unnecessary expense." She kept her eyes on the road. "I've missed it." Caleb said nothing, but he filed it away the way she said it, quiet and matter-of-fact, grief worn smooth by time, but still there underneath. They were 40 minutes outside of Brixton when Clara said, "Someone's following us." Caleb didn't turn around. "How long?" "Since the fork at Ryder Creek. Maybe before." "1 rider." 2. Staying back far enough to look casual. He'd trained himself to notice things like this once, and then let the habit go slack after Eleanor died, because what did it matter who was behind you when you had nothing worth protecting? He was annoyed to discover the habit wasn't entirely gone, just sleeping. "You have good eyes," he said. "I had a man following me for 2 weeks," she said. "You learn." He thought about what to do. Brixton was still 40 minutes out. Turning back wasn't an option. The documents were in his bag, and the county office and Judge Mace's clerk were in Brixton, and reversing course handed Harmon and whoever was behind them exactly the time they needed. "We keep riding," he said. "I agree. If they make a move before we reach town, you ride ahead and don't stop." She looked at him. "I'm not leaving you on the road." "Clara." "I'm not leaving you on the road," she said again, and the tone of it left no room for argument, and he found somewhat to his surprise that he didn't try to make one. They rode into Brixton at a steady pace with 2 riders behind them, keeping a careful distance, and the town opened up around them, the way small county towns do. 1 main street, buildings close together. People going about morning business with the particular unhurried efficiency of people who've lived in the same place long enough to stop being interested in it. The 2 riders behind them did not follow into town. Caleb heard them pull up at the edge of the road and stay there, and he understood what that meant. They were watchers, not actors. Reporting back. Tracking. Not yet authorized to move. Which meant whoever sent them was still calculating. Which meant they still had time, but not much of it. The county recorder's office opened at 8. They were there at 5 past. A thin man with wire-rimmed glasses and ink-stained fingers looked up when they came in and gave Clara a brief, uncertain look. Women in county offices at 8 in the morning were apparently not a regular feature of his days. "We need to file a formal fraud complaint," Clara said before the man could say anything. "Against a land holding company operating under the name J.W. Holdings, and against Hector Harmon of Millhaven in connection with Land Note number 47-18, filed in March of '82. The thin man blinked. "And we need to speak with Judge Mace's clerk about getting a hearing on the court calendar for this session," Clara continued. The matter is time-sensitive. Ma'am, Judge Mace's session doesn't begin for another 3 weeks, yes, we're aware. We'd like to be on the calendar." The thin man looked at Caleb. Caleb nodded once. The thin man looked back at Clara. He appeared to make some internal adjustment to his mourning. "I'll need to see the supporting documentation," he said. Clara opened her bag and laid it on his counter. The next 2 hours were the particular kind of difficult that doesn't involve any physical danger, but requires every other kind of endurance, going through documents line by line with a county official who was careful and slow and asked the same questions in slightly different ways, making sure the answers held. Clara answered everything. She answered with dates and dollar amounts and clause references, and she didn't get flustered, and she didn't repeat herself. And when the recorder pushed back on a point, she laid the relevant document flat on the counter and pointed to the specific language and waited. Caleb sat on a bench against the wall and watched her work. He'd seen people who were good at what they did. He'd seen Emmett cut a calf out of a herd so smoothly the rest barely noticed. He'd seen Eleanor bake bread with one hand while doing 3 other things with the other and make it look like breathing. He knew competence when he saw it, and Clara Whitmore had it in the particular concentrated form that only comes from years of practice at something you're genuinely suited for. It was something watching her. It was something he hadn't felt in a long time, and he put it aside for later, because later was a luxury they hadn't earned yet. At 10:30, the recorder stamped the complaint and gave them a receipt and told them Mace's clerk was in the building down the street. Clara thanked him with the efficiency of someone who appreciated the work but had other places to be. They were 3 steps from the door when it opened from the outside. Hector Harmon walked in. He wasn't alone. There was a man behind him. Someone Caleb didn't recognize, broad-shouldered, wearing a coat that was too heavy for the summer heat, in the particular way that men wear coats that are covering something else. Harmon looked at Caleb. He looked at Clara. He looked at the receipt in Clara's hand, and then at the counter where the recorder was still organizing their documents. His jaw went tight. "Caleb," he said. "Hector. You want to tell me what you're filing?" "I reckon the recorder's office keeps public records," Caleb said. "You can check for yourself." Harmon took a step forward. "This is a mistake. You're making a very big mistake, and you don't even know it, because someone's been—" He looked at Clara. The look he gave her was the kind that had weight to it, deliberate weight, designed to land. "You've known this woman 3 days. 2, Caleb said. "And I know what I know. She's running from her father," Harmon said. "Did she tell you that she's a fugitive from her own family?" "Anything she told you." "She told me about Clause 8, Caleb said. "She told me about the acceleration notice 14 months ago. She told me about the 600 pounds of feed I paid for that never showed up." He looked at Harmon steady and even. "You want to tell me which one of those things isn't true?" Harmon's mouth closed. The man behind him shifted his weight. The recorder had gone very still at his counter. "I'd like you both to leave," Clara said. Her voice was perfectly level. "We've completed our business here." Harmon looked at her for a long moment. Something moved through his expression. Calculation mostly, but underneath it something that might have been the beginning of a realization that this was no longer the situation he'd walked in expecting to manage. "This isn't finished," he said. "No," Clara agreed. "It isn't. It'll be finished in 3 weeks in front of Judge Mace." She tucked the receipt into her bag and fastened the clasp. "We'll see you there." She walked to the door. She walked past Harmon and his companion, with her chin level and her eyes forward, and Caleb stepped in behind her, because there was something about the way she moved in that moment. Not fast, not aggressive, just absolutely certain, that made falling into step behind her feel like the most natural thing he'd done in years. They were on the boardwalk outside before either of them said anything. "He'll send word to Whitfield today," Clara said. "I know. And to whoever Douglas is working for?" She stopped. Caleb turned. She was looking down the street at a man standing at the end of the boardwalk. He was wearing a dark coat and a flat-brimmed hat, and he was looking directly at Clara with the patient, unhurried attention of someone who has been looking for something for a long time and has just found it. Clara went still in the way that animals go still when they've caught a scent they recognize as dangerous. "That's Douglas," she said. He wasn't a large man. He wasn't particularly threatening in the obvious ways, but he had a quality of stillness about him that Caleb recognized, the stillness of a man who was very good at his work and never needed to hurry because he always caught what he was looking for eventually. Douglas touched the brim of his hat. He didn't move toward them. He just stood there and let her see him, and the message in that was clear enough. "I found you. I know where you are. I'm in no rush." Caleb stepped forward, so he was between Clara and the end of the boardwalk. Douglas looked at Caleb with the mild, evaluative expression of a man encountering an unexpected variable. Caleb looked back at him with the expression of a man who has nothing particularly valuable left to lose and has made a private decision about what he's going to protect regardless. The two men looked at each other for 5 seconds. 10. Then Douglas turned and walked down the side street and disappeared. Clara exhaled. "He won't move yet," she said. "He's confirming location, reporting back." "To your father?" "Yes." She was quiet for a moment. "My father didn't know where I was until now. He'll know by tomorrow." She turned to look at Caleb, and something in her face had changed. The controlled professional steadiness was still there, but there was something underneath it now that was less steady. "He'll come himself. He doesn't trust Douglas to negotiate. He'll come in person." "When?" "A week, maybe less." She looked down at her bag. "He's going to try to take me back before the hearing." Caleb was quiet for a moment. He thought about the ranch and the documents, and Judge Mace's calendar, and the two men who'd followed them on the road, and Harmon's face in the recorder's office. And now this, a man at the end of a boardwalk who represented a different threat entirely, and one that was more personal, and therefore more unpredictable. "Come on," he said. "Where?" "Mace's clerk. We get on the calendar. We do what we came here to do." He started walking. "One thing at a time." She fell into step beside him. "You're not worried?" "I'm plenty worried," he said. "But worried doesn't move the work forward." She was quiet for half a step. "Eleanor used to say something like that." He looked at her, surprised. "You have the cadence of a man who learned some things from someone who was good at being steady," she said. I noticed. He thought about Eleanor. He thought about her voice in the kitchen, her particular way of approaching problems, not head-on, but sideways, circling them until she found the angle that made sense. He hadn't thought about that in a long time. He'd been too busy thinking about the absence of her to remember the specific things she'd been. "She did," he said. "Say something like that." Clara nodded and didn't push further, and he was grateful for it. Judge Mace's clerk was a young man named Tolliver, who took their documentation with significantly more energy than the county recorder had. He was the type who found fraud cases interesting, which was exactly the type you wanted when you needed someone to actually read what you'd put in front of them. He read through the complaint summary Clara had prepared. He read the key documents. He looked up twice and asked sharp, specific questions, and both times Clara answered immediately and completely. "Judge Mace is going to want to see these originals," Tolliver said. "We have them," Clara said. "And the witness for the delivery discrepancies, that's your ranch hand, Emmett." "Emmett Cross," Caleb said. 8 years on the property. He can verify the herd count and the delivery records personally." Tolliver made a note. "And you have the signed copy of the original loan document showing Clause 8. "Yes." "And your assertion is that the same individual, Harmon, is the signatory for the land company and the local agent managing the supply fraud." "His name is on the county filing," Clara said. "We have the certified copy." Tolliver nodded slowly. He looked at the documents again. He looked at Clara. "Ma'am, where did you learn to put together a fraud case?" "My father's accounting office," she said. "I watched him build them for people he was defrauding. The architecture is the same in reverse." Tolliver looked at Caleb. Caleb lifted one shoulder. "I'll get you on the calendar," Tolliver said. "First day of session, but I need to tell you if Whitfield gets counsel in here before the hearing and files a counter motion, the judge may require a postponement to allow response time." "How do we prevent that?" Caleb said. "You can't entirely, but the stronger your documentation, the harder it is for the counter motion to gain traction. You want Mace to see this file before he sees anything from the other side. Then we need to get this to him before the session starts," Clara said. "Is there a way to transmit the case summary directly to the judge?" Tolliver hesitated. "He's in Helena until the session. I can send a courier with the summary and the certified filing. He'll have it before he arrives." "Please do that," Clara said. Tolliver made another note. He looked at the pile of documents and then back up. "I have to ask, Miss Whitmore, your name is on some of these documents as having processed accounts through your father's firm. If opposing counsel uses that—" "I know," Clara said. "I was 17 when most of those accounts were opened, and 23 when I understood what they were for and left. I'll testify to that directly if the judge requires it." Her voice didn't waver. "I'm not trying to protect my own history here. I'm trying to stop what it was part of." Tolliver looked at her for a moment. Then he nodded once with the respectful gravity of someone who recognizes when a person is telling the absolute truth. They left his office at noon. On the way back through town, Caleb stopped at the general store that wasn't Harmon's, a smaller place run by a woman named Addie Brecht, who had a reputation for being both honest and inconveniently thorough with her records, and bought supplies, and asked Addie casually whether she'd heard anything about JW Holdings or any land dealings involving Warren Aldrich in the last year. Addie gave him a look over her counter that suggested the question wasn't as casual as he'd made it sound. She was in her 60s and had been running that store since before Caleb was born. And she had the particular perceptiveness of a woman who had spent 40 years watching people buy things when they were scared and buy different things when they were planning something. "Warren Aldrich," she said slowly, "has bought 3 properties on the North Ridge in the last 18 months, all of them through land companies with Helena addresses." She folded her hands on the counter. "And I'll tell you something else for free, Caleb Dawson. 2 weeks ago, a man came through here asking about your property, asking about the water access on the east side specifically. He said he was a surveyor." She paused. "He wasn't carrying any surveying equipment." Clara, who had been standing one step behind Caleb, said quietly, "Did you get his name?" "Said his name was Pruitt," Addie said. "Gerald Pruitt. The man who'd signed the acceleration notice letter 14 months ago." Caleb looked at Clara. Clara looked at the counter for a moment. Then she looked up at Addie. "Ma'am, would you be willing to put that in writing, what you just told us? A sworn statement." Addie studied her. "Who are you?" "Her name's Clara Whitmore," Caleb said. "She's helping me sort out some trouble with my land." Addie looked at Clara for a long moment with the evaluative steadiness of a woman who has met a great many people over a great many years and sorted them into reliable categories. Then she pulled a sheet of paper from under the counter and picked up a pen. "Tell me what you need me to write," she said. They were back on this road to Dawson Ridge by 2 in the afternoon with Addie's sworn statement in the oilcloth package alongside everything else, and Caleb felt the weight of that package differently now. It had become something real and specific. Not just papers a case. A real buildable case. Clara rode beside him and didn't say much for a while. The heat of the afternoon had flattened out to the particular heavy warmth of mid-July Montana, and the road home was quieter than the road out had been. "Douglas will have sent word by now," she said eventually. "I know. My father moves fast when he has a location. He'll hire the fastest private coach available." She calculated quietly. 6 days, maybe 5. And the hearing is 3 weeks out. Yes, he let that sit for a moment. "You think he'll come in person?" "He always comes in person when it matters." Something shifted in her voice. "He'll want to see me. He'll think that if he can talk to me directly, he'll think he can make me come back." "Can he?" She looked at the road ahead. "Before I left Chicago, I would have said I didn't know. I was afraid of him. Not of what he'd do to me, he wasn't a man who used violence, but afraid of his certainty. He has a way of making you feel like your own judgment is faulty, like the only sensible thing is to defer to him. She paused. But I've been here 4 days, and I've done more honest work in 4 days than in the last 4 years, and I know what I know. He can't talk me back from that. What if he threatens the hearing? Caleb said. What if he shows up with a lawyer and files something that muddies the case? Clara was quiet for a moment. He might. He has the money for it. She looked at him. That's why we need Mace to have the documents before my father's lawyers can get anything in front of him. We need to be first. Tolliver's sending the courier. Yes, but I want to write something directly to Mace myself. A letter, explaining my connection to Whitfield through my father's firm before anyone else has the chance to use it against you. She looked at her hands on the reins. The worst version of this is that my father shows up, and the first thing Mace hears about me is that I'm a fugitive running from my family. I'd rather he hear my account first. That's smart, Caleb said. It's honest, she corrected. Smart would have been leaving Chicago 2 years earlier. He almost smiled. Almost. They were a mile from the ranch when they saw the smoke. Not a fire, just the particular thin gray drift of smoke that meant someone had a stove going in the middle of the afternoon, which nobody on the property would have. Emmett didn't cook during work hours, and there was no reason for a stove to be lit. Caleb pulled up. Clara pulled up beside him and saw what he saw and said nothing. He unslung his rifle from the saddle scabbard. Clara reached into her bag, and he noticed for the first time that she pulled out a small pistol with the practiced ease of someone who had carried it for a while. He looked at it. I've had it since St. Louis, she said. I don't know if I could actually... She stopped. I'd like not to find out. Stay behind me. You keep saying that. Keep meaning it. They came in from the east side off the road, moving quiet. Caleb's horse knew the property well enough to pick its way without being directed, and Clara's borrowed horse followed its lead. They came around the side of the barn, and Caleb saw 2 horses tied at the post outside the house that he didn't recognize. A third horse, Emmett's bay, was in the corral where it shouldn't be if Emmett was working the south pasture. Emmett's inside, Caleb said quietly. How do you know? Because his horse is here, and Emmett doesn't leave his horse in the corral mid-afternoon unless something made him come back early. Clara nodded. Caleb dismounted and handed her his reins. If you hear shooting, you ride for Brixton, and you don't stop and you ask for Tolliver at the courthouse. He knows the case. Caleb. Clara. She looked at him. He looked at her. There was a moment between them that lasted about 3 seconds, and contained things that neither of them had vocabulary for yet, and then he walked toward the house. He went in through the back, through the kitchen door, which opened without sound, because he'd oiled those hinges 6 months ago, and the habit of a well-kept house had outlasted everything else. He heard voices. 2 men. Neither of them Emmett. He moved through the kitchen. He could see into the front room from the kitchen doorway. Emmett was sitting in a chair by the window with his hands tied in front of him, and the specific careful stillness of a man who's doing the math on his options and not finding any of them satisfactory. One man stood near the door. The other was going through the papers on the desk where Caleb had put the second oilcloth package, the copy of the documents he'd left at home. The man at the desk said, "It's not here. She must have taken everything with her." The man near the door said, "Harmon said..." "I know what Harmon said. I'm telling you, it's not here." Caleb stepped into the doorway. Both men turned. The one near the door went for something at his hip. Caleb raised the rifle. "I wouldn't," Caleb said. The man near the door took a very careful look at Caleb's face and made a decision. He moved his hand away from his hip. "Both of you," Caleb said, "are going to step outside. You're going to untie my man, and then you're going to get on your horses and ride back to whoever sent you, and you're going to tell him that I found everything I needed to find, and it's already at the county courthouse, and there isn't a thing in this house worth burning down." The man at the desk looked at the man near the door. Something passed between them. "Harmon's not going to like..." the desk man started. Harmon, Caleb said, is going to be standing in front of a circuit court judge in 3 weeks. I reckon he's got bigger problems than what I like or don't like. He kept the rifle where it was. Outside, now. They went. Emmett Hands-Freed stood up and rolled his shoulders back and looked at Caleb with the expression of a man who has had a very long afternoon. They were here when I rode in for the noon meal, Emmett said. Already inside. Didn't hurt me. Just tied me up and went through the papers. He paused. I'm glad to say they didn't find the copy I hid in the loft. Good man, Caleb said. Outside, the 2 horses that weren't theirs were already moving down the road. Clara was standing at the corner of the barn with the small pistol still in her hand, and her eyes tracking the riders until they were well out of range. Caleb walked to her. She looked at the road. She looked at him. She lowered the pistol. They were looking for the documents, she said. Didn't find them. She exhaled. A long, controlled exhale, the kind you do when you've been holding your breath for longer than you realized. Harmon's escalating, she said. He wouldn't have sent men here if he wasn't scared. Good, Caleb said. Scared men make mistakes. Clara looked at him. She looked at his face in the late afternoon light. This man who had walked into his own house with a rifle and no hesitation to defend property that was his, and a man who worked it and documents that were the only thing standing between him and losing everything. She didn't say anything for a moment. Then she said, I need to write that letter to Judge Mace tonight. Kitchen table's clear, he said. She nodded. She started toward the house. Clara, he said. She turned. He looked at her. He was quiet for a moment, a man choosing words with the care of someone who doesn't use them freely. Thank you, he said, for coming back in with me. She held his gaze. You didn't ask me to. No, he said. I know. Something shifted in her face, the last edge of the controlled professional distance she'd been carrying since she arrived. Just for a second. Just enough. Then she turned and went inside, and Caleb stood in the yard for a moment longer, listening to the summer quiet settle back into place around the ranch. It wasn't the same quiet as before. He didn't know yet what to call what it was instead, but it was different. And the difference, for the first time in 3 years, didn't feel like loss. Clara wrote the letter to Judge Mace that night by lamplight, while Caleb and Emmett sat at the other end of the table and went through every remaining document in the box, pulling anything that had a date, a name, or a number that could corroborate what they'd already filed. She wrote for 2 hours without stopping. 4 pages front and back in her precise, steady hand. When she finished, she read it through, once made 3 corrections, and set it flat on the table to dry. Caleb picked it up and read it. She watched him read. She had learned in 4 days that Caleb Dawson read the way he did most things completely, without rushing, without performing the act of reading for anyone watching. He just did it. When he finished, he set it down. You didn't have to include the part about your father's firm, he said. Yes, I did. It makes your position more complicated. My position is already complicated. At least this way the complication comes from me first. She reached over and folded the letter precisely. A judge like Mace respects someone who doesn't hide the hard parts. Tolliver said so himself. Caleb looked at her for a moment. You're protecting the case. I'm protecting you, she said. And then she seemed to hear how that sounded because she looked back at the letter and said more evenly, I'm protecting the case. Emmett across the table became very interested in the document he was holding. Caleb said nothing. He reached for the next paper in the stack. The letter went out with Emmett at first light, addressed to Tolliver, with a note asking him to include it in the courier package to Helena. Emmett rode fast and came back by mid-morning. Tolliver had confirmed the courier left that morning already, but he'd send a second one with Clara's letter that same afternoon. It was done. Whatever was coming, Judge Mace would have their account of it first. That should have felt like breathing room. It didn't. Because on the morning of the 5th day, Richard Whitmore arrived in Millhaven. Caleb heard about it from Addie Brecht, who sent a note out to the ranch by way of her delivery boy. The note said simply, Eastern man in town. Asking about Clara. Brought a lawyer. Thought you should know. A.B. He found Clara in this kitchen going over the tax records one more time, looking for anything they might have missed. He put the note on the table in front of her. She read it. She set it down. She was quiet for exactly 4 seconds. He counted without meaning to. "All right," she said. "All right," he said. "I knew he was coming." She folded the note once. "I'd hoped for another day or two." She looked at the records in front of her. "He'll come here. He won't wait for me to come to him. It's not his style. When? Today. Tomorrow morning at the latest." She stood up. She walked to the window, not to look out, he'd noticed, but to think. She did her best thinking on her feet, facing away from the room. "He'll have a lawyer who knows territorial law. He'll argue that I'm a dependent under his household, that I left under circumstances that compromise my judgment, possibly that I was coerced." She turned. "He'll try to make this about my mental state. Can he? He can try. The question is whether Mace has received enough of our material to contextualize whatever legal argument my father brings." She looked at the table. "We need one more thing." "What?" "Someone who knows my father's business dealings with Whitfield directly. Not me, I'm interested. Someone neutral who can confirm the connection." She thought for a moment. "Is there a telegraph office in Brixton?" "There is. I need to send a message to a man named Arthur Fenn. He's an accountant in St. Louis. He audited 3 of my father's contracts, including one with Whitfield in '79. He told me once privately that he thought the land dealings were structured to defraud." She paused. "I don't know if he'll respond, but if he does, and if Mace receives a wire from an independent St. Louis accountant corroborating the Whitfield connection..." "It changes the shape of the case," Caleb said. "It changes the entire shape," she said. "It takes it from a local land dispute to an interstate fraud pattern. A circuit court judge doesn't just rule on that, he refers it upward, federal territory." Caleb reached for his hat. "Write the message. We'll ride to Brixton and send it before noon." She was already reaching for paper. They made it to Brixton and back in under 4 hours, which was fast enough that Caleb's horse had opinions about it that it expressed with its ears. The telegraph operator in Brixton had given Clara a look of moderate surprise when she dictated the message, and moderate more surprise when she paid for it from her own money coin she'd been careful with since Chicago, spending only what she had to. He hadn't said anything which Caleb respected. They were barely back on the property when they heard the carriage. It was a hired coach from Brixton. Good one, expensive, the kind that men like Richard Whitmore chose specifically because the quality of the vehicle communicated something before they even stepped out of it. It came up the road to Dawson Ridge in the late afternoon, with a deliberateness that said it had the full confidence of whoever was inside it. Clara stood in the yard and watched it come. Caleb stood beside her. Emmett had appeared from somewhere near the barn and taken up a position that was casual in the way that a man with 8 years of loyalty behind him is casual, present, watchful, and not going anywhere. The carriage stopped. The door opened. Richard Whitmore stepped out. He was a tall man, well-made, with gray at his temples, and the bearing of someone who had spent so many years being the most important person in every room that his body had simply accepted it as a permanent condition. He wore a dark suit and carried a hat in his hand, and he looked at the yard and the barn and the house, and then at his daughter with an expression that contained multitudes. Relief, anger, calculation, and underneath it all, something that might have been genuine feeling if it had ever been given room to grow. "Clara," he said. "Father," she said. A second man stepped out of the carriage behind him, shorter, with a document case, and the particular alert eyes of a lawyer who was already reading the situation for legal relevance. Richard Whitmore looked at Caleb. "You're Dawson," he said. "I am," Caleb said. "My daughter has been on your property for 5 days." "She has. I'd like to speak with her privately." "That's her decision," Caleb said. Whitmore's jaw tightened. He looked at Clara. "We should speak inside, privately." "Whatever you have to say," Clara said, "you can say here." Something moved through her father's face. Not surprise exactly, more like a man recalibrating, recognizing that the person in front of him was not quite the person he'd come to collect. "Clara, you left in the middle of the night without—" "I left because you sold me," she said. Her voice was steady and clear and not loud. "To Whitmore Gale, for freight contracts, without asking me, without telling me. I found out from a letter Gale wrote to your office discussing the terms of our arrangement as if I were a line item." She looked at him. "I'd like you to tell me which part of that I misunderstood." Richard Whitmore was quiet for a moment. The lawyer behind him had stopped moving. "It wasn't like that," her father said. And the thing that Caleb noticed watching was that the man almost believed it. He had the particular quality of men who arrange the world to suit themselves for so long that the arranging had stopped feeling like something they did and started feeling like something that simply was. "Gale is a good man, a wealthy man. You would have had a stable life." "I have a stable life," Clara said. "I'm building one." "Clara." Her father's voice shifted, lower, more personal. "You're 28 years old, and you're on a ranch in Montana with a man you've known less than a week. Whatever you think you're doing here." "She's saving the ranch," Caleb said. Whitmore looked at him. "Your daughter," Caleb said, "has been working for 5 days to expose a land fraud that's been running for 3 years, a fraud that connects to Joseph Whitfield, who connects to your firm." He watched the man's face. "I think you know that name." The lawyer made a small sound that wasn't quite a word. Whitmore's expression went very careful. "I don't know what she's told you. She didn't have to tell me much," Caleb said. "The documents told most of it. The county filing in March of '82, the acceleration notice, the fee discrepancies running back 2 years. We've got all of it filed with the county recorder in Brixton, and Judge Mace's clerk has a full summary in Helena right now." He kept his voice even. "If your name appears anywhere in those documents as associated with Whitfield's operations in this territory, and I reckon Clara would know better than me whether it does. Then the question of whether she comes home with you stops being the most interesting question in this conversation." The silence that followed was the particular kind that contains a complete rearrangement of power. Richard Whitmore looked at his daughter. Something in his face had changed the authority still there, but cracked slightly like good china that's been handled too hard. "Clara," he said, and his voice was different now, quieter. "What have you filed?" "Everything I know," she said. "Everything I processed through your office that connects to Whitfield's land operations in Montana and Wyoming. 3 contracts, 2 county filings, the original correspondence." She paused. "I've also written a personal letter to Judge Mace, explaining my role and my reason for coming forward." Her father looked at her for a long moment. "You've implicated yourself," he said. "I've explained myself," she said. "There's a difference. I was 17 when it started, and 23 when I understood it, and 28 when I stopped it. I'll take whatever comes from that." She held his gaze. "But it stops." Whitmore turned away from her. He looked at the lawyer. Something passed between them that Caleb couldn't read, but the lawyer clearly could, because the man's expression went from watchful to calculating to something more neutral and careful. Whitmore turned back. "The Gale arrangement," he said slowly, "can be renegotiated." "It can be cancelled," Clara said. "Clara, cancelled, father. I'm not a contract term." Whitmore looked at Caleb again. It was a different look this time. Not the assessing look of a man sizing up an obstacle, but something more complicated, the look of a man trying to understand a situation that had moved past what he'd prepared for. "Are you married?" he asked Caleb directly. "Not currently," Caleb said. "Are you planning to be?" "That's not a question I can answer for you right now," Caleb said, "and it's not one that has bearing on whether your daughter goes back to Chicago." "Everything has bearing," Whitmore said with the reflexive certainty of a man who negotiated for a living. "She's a grown woman," Caleb said. "She's here by her own choice. She's done work here that matters. What she does after that is hers to decide, not mine and not yours. Whitmore looked at him for a long moment. Then he did something Caleb hadn't expected. He laughed. It was a short, dry sound, not particularly warm, but not entirely without humor. "She used to say things like that," he said, and for a moment Caleb wasn't sure who he meant, Clara or her mother. "My wife. She used to say a person's life was their own to spend." He looked at his hat, turning it in his hands. "I thought that was impractical." "Maybe it is," Caleb said. "Doesn't make it wrong." Another silence. Clara said, "Father, if you go back to Chicago and you distance yourself from Whitfield formally on record before the hearing, it helps both of us. A judge looking at this case sees a man who withdrew from a fraudulent operation rather than a man who defended it. That's a meaningful difference." Her father looked at her. "You're advising me. I'm giving you the same accounting I'd give anyone who asked," she said. "The numbers are the numbers. What you do with them is your choice." The lawyer stepped forward and said something quietly into Whitmore's ear. Whitmore listened without changing his expression. Then he nodded once. He put his hat back on. He looked at Clara. "You look like your mother," he said. It came out differently than anything else he'd said, without strategy, without preparation. Like something that had slipped through a gap. Clara's face changed for just a moment. "I know," she said quietly. He looked at Caleb one more time. "Take care of the property," he said. It sounded like he meant more than one thing. Then he turned and got back in the carriage, and the lawyer followed, and the coach turned around and went back down the road toward Millhaven. Clara stood in the yard and watched it go. Emmett from near the barn said quietly, "Well." He didn't say anything else. He went back inside the barn and closed the door. Caleb stood beside Clara in the early evening quiet. She didn't speak for a while. He didn't try to make her. When she finally turned to look at him, her eyes were bright, not crying but close to it, the way eyes go when something large and held in finally releases its pressure. "He looked old," she said. "He did." Caleb agreed. "I didn't expect that." He waited. "He's not a good man," she said. "But he's not simply a villain either. He's a man who made his children into business assets and called it providing for them, and I don't think he ever once understood the difference." She looked at the empty road. "That's almost sadder than if he'd just been cruel." Caleb thought about that. He thought about Harmon at Eleanor's graveside. The patience of men who waited for you to be weak and then used the weakness against you. That was different from what Clara's father was, smaller, meaner. Whitmore was something else. He was a man who had convinced himself the cage was a gift. "Do you think he'll do it?" Caleb said. "Distance himself from Whitfield before the hearing." "Yes," she said without hesitation. "Not because it's right. Because it's good business." She almost smiled. "He raised me to understand that distinction. He just never expected me to use it against him." They went back inside. The days between her father's departure and the hearing moved differently than the days before it. The urgency was still there. They had work to finish Emmett's formal witness statement to get notarized in Brixton, a response to prepare if Whitfield's lawyers filed anything. But underneath the urgency, something had loosened. Like a rope pulled tight for so long that when the tension finally eased, you could feel the fibers themselves exhale. Clara stayed. She didn't talk about leaving for Millhaven anymore, and Caleb didn't mention it. They both understood without discussing it and without naming it that the situation required her here, that the case required her here, and that it was easier for both of them to let the situation carry the weight of the decision, rather than put it on whatever was happening between them, which neither of them was ready to name. What was happening between them was this: they worked well together. Better than well. They thought in compatible ways. She moved fast and logically, and he moved slower and practically, and together they covered ground that neither of them covered alone. She challenged his assumptions, and he grounded her conclusions and the arguments they had, because they had arguments, real ones, not the polite friction of two people being careful with each other, were the kind that ended with both of them knowing more than they had before. One evening, 6 days before the hearing, she looked up from the papers and said, You fixed the north fence yourself this summer. I did. All of it. What's left of it, yeah. She looked at him. That's 300 feet of fence line. Give or take. By yourself. Emmett was working cattle. She was quiet for a moment. Caleb, when did you last take a day where you didn't work from before sunrise to after dark? He thought about it. He thought about it longer than a man should need to. I don't remember, he said. She looked at him the way she looked at documents directly, without flinching, seeing what was actually there rather than what was supposed to be there. You've been trying to work yourself past something, she said. You think if you stop moving it'll catch up to you. He looked at the table. Eleanor's been gone 3 years, she said quietly. Not harshly. Just a fact placed carefully. The grief doesn't go away if you fence it out. I know that, he said. But you keep fencing, she said. He looked at her. What am I supposed to do instead? And she said, let someone stand next to you while you feel it. That's all. You don't have to explain it or resolve it. You just don't have to be alone with it. The kitchen was very quiet. He'd had people offer him comfort before. After Eleanor died, the town of Millhaven had produced an impressive quantity of casseroles and condolences, and a visiting minister who'd told him grief was God's way of measuring love, and Caleb had thanked him politely and gone back to work. None of it had touched anything real. It all slid off the outside of him like water off a slicker. This was different. This was a woman who had watched him for 5 days and understood something specific about him, and said it plainly without asking for anything in return. He said, she used to sit in that chair. He pointed to the chair at the end of the table, the one Clara had been consistently not sitting in since she arrived, though he hadn't consciously noticed that until right now. She had a particular way of sitting in it, sideways with her legs over the arm when she was reading. Drove me crazy because it couldn't have been comfortable. He stopped. I've never told anyone that. Clara looked at the chair. She looked back at him. It sounds like her, she said. He almost asked how she could know that. Then he understood it wasn't that she knew Eleanor. It was that she'd been listening to him for 5 days and had assembled enough to say something true. Yeah, he said. It does. 2 days before the hearing, Arthur Fenn's wire arrived from St. Louis. Tolliver sent a boy out to the ranch with it at noon. Caleb was in the barn when the boy rode up, and Clara was in the house, and she came to the barn door with the telegram in her hand, and she read it to him without preamble. Received your message. Will provide written statement and travel to Brixton if required. Whitfield connection to Hargrove Holdings confirmed and documented. Recommend federal referral. A. Fenn. C.P. A. St. Louis. Caleb looked at the wire. Hargrove Holdings, he said. A third company, Clara said. I didn't know about that one. She read it again. Which means the operation is bigger than we documented. Whitfield isn't just running fraud in Montana, he's got a network. And Fenn's willing to testify. He's willing to testify. She looked up. Caleb, if Mace refers this to a federal circuit. Whitfield doesn't just lose the land case, Caleb said. He loses everything. And Harmon with him, she said. And Aldrich. The wire in her hand was small, one thin piece of paper, but it had the weight of something that had just changed size. What had been a local land dispute had just become something that would draw attention from people much higher than a county judge. The kind of attention that men like Whitfield spent considerable money and energy avoiding. He's going to know about this, Caleb said. When Fenn sends the written statement to Mace Whitfield's lawyers, we'll find out. Yes. Which means the 2 days we have before the hearing are the most dangerous 2 days. Clara folded the wire. We don't leave the property without Emmett. We keep the documents split half here, half with Tolliver already, and we go to the hearing together. He nodded. She started to turn back toward the house. Clara, he said. She stopped. He'd been carrying something for days. The careful accumulation of small specific things, the way she handled the recorder in Brixton, the way she'd looked at the carriage taking her father away, the things she'd said about letting someone stand next to you. He'd been carrying them without knowing what to do with them, and now they were heavy enough that not saying something felt more dishonest than his usual silence allowed for. "When this is over," he said, "you were going to Millhaven." "I was," she said. "Is that still—" He stopped, started again. "The school position. That's what you wanted." She looked at him for a moment. "I wanted something that was mine," she said. "Something I chose." She paused. Millhaven was a direction, not necessarily a destination. He looked at her. She looked at him. The barn smelled like hay and horses, and the particular warmth of a summer afternoon, and somewhere outside, Emmett was doing something that involved a hammer, and the distance between where Caleb was standing and where Clara was standing was about 6 feet, and it felt both very large and not large at all. "The ranch needs someone who knows accounts," he said. "The ranch has Emmett. Emmett is excellent with cattle," Caleb said. "He cannot read a supply invoice without making the same arithmetic error twice." Something moved across Clara's face. The professional distance and the careful control, and underneath it, something that had been sitting there for days, just waiting for enough space to be itself. "Are you offering me a job?" she said. He held her gaze. "I'm offering you a choice," he said. "Which is different. You can go to Millhaven and teach school, and that's a good life. Or you can stay here, and we can figure out what this is." He paused. "I won't pretend I know what it is yet, but I know it's something." Clara looked at him for a long moment. "Ask me again," she said after the hearing. "Fair enough," he said. She went back inside. He stood in the barn doorway and listened to the hammer and the horses and the summer wind coming off the ridge, and felt something he hadn't felt in 3 years. The night before the hearing, Hector Harmon disappeared from Millhaven. Tolliver sent word at 9 in the evening, a note delivered by his clerk who'd ridden out specifically because Tolliver thought they needed to know before morning. Harmon had closed his store mid-afternoon, loaded 2 horses, and left town heading south. No one had seen him go. The store was locked. Clara read the note. She set it down. "He's running," Emmett said. "He's running," she confirmed. Caleb looked at the note, then at Clara. "Does this hurt us?" She shook her head slowly. "It might help us. A man who runs the day before a fraud hearing." She looked up. "That's not a man who thinks he's going to win." "But we need him for the full case," Caleb said. "If he's not there to answer—" "We don't need him there," she said. "We need his name on the county filing, which it is. We need his connection to Whitfield documented, which it is. A judge doesn't need the guilty man present to rule on the evidence of what he did." She picked up the note again. "And if Harmon is running, that means someone told him this morning that the case is stronger than he thought." "Fenn's wire," Caleb said. "Fenn's wire," she agreed. He sat down. He looked at the table. He looked at all of it. The documents, the notes, the copy of the loan agreement, Addie's sworn statement, Emmett's notarized witness account, the receipt from the county recorder, Tolliver's calendar confirmation. 5 days ago, this table had an unpaid invoice on it, and a ledger with gaps in it, and a box of unopened mail that had been slowly condemning him for 14 months. Now it had a case. "Get some sleep," Clara said. "Both of you." She was already organizing the final document packet for the morning. "We leave at 7. We walk in there together, and we let the evidence do the talking." Emmett went to his bunk. Caleb stayed at the table. "You should sleep too," she said without looking up. "I will," he said. He didn't move. She glanced at him. She set down her pen. She looked at him with that direct, unhurried attention she gave to things that mattered. "We're going to win tomorrow," she said. "How do you know?" "Because we're right," she said. "And we have the paper to prove it. And Judge Mace is by all accounts a man who reads paper." He looked at her across the table. "You're not worried at all." She was quiet for a moment. "I'm terrified," she said. "But I've learned that being terrified and being ready aren't opposites. You can be both at the same time." She picked up her pen again. "Now go to sleep, Caleb." He went to sleep. And in the morning, they rode to Brixton together, the three of them, with the oilcloth package across Caleb's saddle, and the summer sun coming up hard and bright over the ridge, and Clara rode with her back straight and her eyes on the road, and didn't look back once. She didn't need to. They rode into Brixton at 7:30, and the town was already awake in the particular way that small county towns wake up when something important is happening. People moving with purpose. Conversations happening in doorways. The courthouse steps already occupied by men who had no official business there, but intended to watch anyway. Word had traveled. It always did. Always. Tolliver met them outside the courthouse with a look on his face that Caleb couldn't immediately read. Not quite worried, not quite relieved, something in between. "Whitfield's lawyers arrived last night," Tolliver said. "Two of them. From Helena. They filed a motion this morning to postpone the hearing pending additional discovery." Clara said, "Mace received our documents." "He did. Courier arrived in Helena 3 days ago. Mace rode in last night early. Didn't announce it." Tolliver glanced at the courthouse door. "He's been in his chambers since 6 this morning." "And the postponement motion?" Clara said. "He hasn't ruled on it yet. Hearing starts at 9. Tolliver looked at the document package under Caleb's arm. "You have everything. Everything we filed, and the original documents," Clara said. "Plus Emmett's notarized statement and Addie Brecht's sworn account." "Fen. He sent a written statement by wire yesterday afternoon. You should have received it." "I did." Tolliver nodded. "It's in the file." He paused. "Miss Whitmore, Whitfield's lawyers know about your connection to your father's firm. They're going to use it." "I know," she said. "Let them." Tolliver looked at her for a moment, then at Caleb, then nodded again in the way of a man who has decided he's done everything he can and the rest is up to other people. They went inside. The courtroom was small by any city standard and large by Brixton's. Wooden benches along both sides already half filled with people who had found reasons to be there. A table on the left where two men in good suits sat with a leather document case between them, Whitfield's lawyers, both of them carrying the careful, expensive stillness of men paid to appear untroubled. A table on the right empty. Clara walked to the right table and sat down like she'd been sitting at courtroom tables her whole life. Caleb sat beside her. Emmett took a seat on the bench directly behind them. One of Whitfield's lawyers looked at Clara. It was a deliberate look, the kind that was meant to be noticed. She didn't return it. She opened her document packet and began organizing the papers in the order she wanted them. At 8:55, the doors at the back of the courtroom opened and Warren Aldrich walked in. Caleb felt the shift in the room before he consciously processed who it was. A change in the quality of attention, people straightening or looking away, the particular atmospheric adjustment that powerful local men produce when they enter a room they're accustomed to owning. Aldrich was in his 50s, heavy-set with the permanently settled expression of a man who had not been surprised by anything in a very long time. He walked to the front bench on Whitfield's side and sat down, and didn't look at Caleb directly, which was its own kind of statement. Clara didn't look up from her papers. "Aldrich is here," Caleb said quietly. "I know," she said. "Don't look at him." "I'm not." "I can tell by your breathing that you want to." He exhaled. She was right. He focused on the papers. At 9 o'clock exactly, Judge Harlan Mace came through the side door. He was older than Caleb had expected. Mid-60s, lean, with close-cropped white hair, and the kind of face that had processed a great deal of human behavior over a long career and arrived at a permanent expression of patient, demanding attention. He moved like a man who had long ago decided that hurrying was an affectation. He sat, arranged his papers, looked at the room over the top of his glasses, and said without any preamble whatsoever, "We'll address the postponement motion first." Whitfield's lead lawyer stood. He was perhaps 45, with the practiced confidence of a man who had argued in front of a great many judges. "Your Honor, the defense respectfully submits that the scope of the fraud allegations as presented requires additional time for counsel." Mace said, "I have read every document filed in this matter. I read them twice, in fact, because the first time I thought I'd misunderstood the scope. He looked at the lawyer over his glasses. I hadn't. Motion denied. We proceed today. The lawyer sat down. Clara beside Caleb did not visibly react, but he felt her exhale. What followed was 2 hours of the most concentrated factual argument Caleb had ever witnessed, though his experience of such things was limited to a cattle dispute in 1879 that had been resolved mostly by both parties agreeing they were tired of arguing. This was different. This was Clara Whitmore standing up at a courtroom table in Brixton, Montana, and walking a federal circuit judge through 3 years of coordinated fraud with the precision of someone who had spent her formative years on exactly this kind of material and had been waiting without knowing it for a courtroom where it actually mattered. She went through the loan document first. Clause 7, Clause 8, the language that had been explained to Caleb as standard and was not standard. Mace asked 2 sharp questions, and she answered them without hesitation and cited the specific page and line of the document each time. She went through the fee discrepancies. February, March, April, the delivery records. Emmett's notarized statement confirming the actual herd count against the county filing. Addie Brecht's sworn account of the surveyor who wasn't a surveyor. She laid out the J.W. Holdings County filing with Harmon's name on it. She explained the connection between Harmon and Whitfield using the correspondence from the unopened box. She referenced Arthur Fenn's written statement from St. Louis confirming the broader network. And then she said, "Your Honor, I have to be transparent about something." Mace looked at her. My name appears in several of the historical Whitfield documents as having processed accounting records through my father's firm. I was employed in that capacity from the age of 17. I am standing before you now because I understand what those documents were used for, and because I have an obligation that is more important to me than protecting my own history. Mace was quiet for a moment. Miss Whitmore, he said, I received your personal letter 4 days ago. I read it. He paused. I appreciate its candor. Continue. Whitfield's lawyer stood. Your Honor, the witness's acknowledged connection to the original fraudulent instruments is a material conflict of... The witness is not on trial, Mace said. Sit down. He sat down. Clara continued. The twist came at 11:45 minutes into the formal proceeding, and it came from the last place any of them expected. The back doors of the courtroom opened, and a man walked in, not hurrying, not dramatic, just walking with the patient confidence of someone who had traveled a long way and intended to be heard. He was perhaps 60, with a St. Louis suit and ink-stained fingers and wire-rimmed glasses. Arthur Fenn had not just sent a statement. He had come in person. Clara turned and saw him. Something crossed her face that she didn't immediately contain relief, and something more than relief. The specific gratitude of a person who has been standing alone in a fight for longer than they realized, and has just seen reinforcement appear at the door. Fenn took a seat on the bench behind Caleb and Emmett. He nodded at Clara. She turned back to the front. Mace had watched this exchange. He said, Mr. Fenn, I understand you've submitted a written statement. Do you intend to offer oral testimony? Fenn stood. If the court finds it useful, Your Honor. I do, Mace said. We'll hear from you after Miss Whitmore concludes. Whitfield's lawyer was on his feet again. Your Honor, this witness was not disclosed in advance of. He submitted a written statement to this court 3 days ago, Mace said without heat. His attendance is a courtesy, not a surprise. Sit down, counsel. Arthur Fenn's testimony lasted 22 minutes, and it was in Caleb's estimation the most quietly devastating thing he had ever heard delivered in a calm accountant's voice. Fenn walked the court through the Whitfield network, not just the Montana operations, but 3 other territories, 8 properties, a pattern of loan structuring that had been specifically designed to transfer land from working ranchers and farmers to speculative holding companies over a period of years. He named dates and amounts and document numbers. He described the Hargrove Holdings subsidiary that Clara hadn't known about. He confirmed that Richard Whitmore's firm had processed 2 of the original transactions, and that to the best of his professional knowledge, those transactions had been managed by a junior accountant who had subsequently departed the firm. He looked at Clara when he said it. She looked back at him. He had protected her even in the testimony. The junior accountant who departed. Not a name, not an indictment. She had not asked him for that. He had done it anyway. Whitfield's lawyers cross-examined Fenn for 11 minutes. Fenn answered every question with the pleasant, immovable patience of a man who had been doing arithmetic since before their lawyers were born, and was not going to be rattled by people who needed to use words like allegedly in order to function. At 12:30, Mace called a brief recess. In the corridor outside, Clara stood against the wall and Caleb stood beside her, and for a moment, neither of them said anything, because there wasn't anything to say that would add to what had just happened in that room. Emmett handed them both water from the jug he'd had the foresight to bring. Caleb reflected consistently, the most practically useful person he knew. Fenn came, Clara said. He did, Caleb said. I didn't ask him to come in person. I know. She looked at her hands. He could have just sent the statement, coming in person. She stopped. He took a risk. His name is on documents connected to my father's firm. Maybe he's been waiting for a reason to say what he knows, Caleb said. She considered that. Maybe, she said. Or maybe... She stopped again. She seemed to be sorting through something internal, something that was older and heavier than the morning's proceedings. What? Caleb said. I spent 4 years telling myself that what I did wasn't my fault, because I was young, and I didn't understand, and I was following instructions. She looked up. But Fenn's been carrying the same weight for longer than I have, and he came here. He made a different choice than just carrying it. She paused. I think I've been waiting to see if that was actually possible, for someone who knew what I knew to still choose to act. Clara, Caleb said. You've been acting. You've been acting for the last 2 weeks. She looked at him. You got on a coach, he said. You left Chicago. You sat down at a stranger's kitchen table and you fixed what was broken. That's not a person who's been standing still. She held his gaze for a moment. Her eyes were very clear. You're not bad at this, she said. At what? Saying the thing that matters. He looked at the wall. I'm out of practice, he said. Used to be better at it. Eleanor. Clara was quiet. Then, she must have been something. She was, he said. She'd have liked you. Something moved across Clara's face, startled, and then settling into something that was very still and very warm. That might be the kindest thing you've said to me, she said. Don't tell Emmett, he said. He'll think I'm going soft. I heard that, Emmett said from 4 feet away. They went back inside. The afternoon session lasted 90 minutes. Mace was thorough, and he was fast, the combination of a man who had done his reading in advance and wasn't going to waste the court's time on things he already understood. Whitfield's lawyers made their formal argument. They were good. Caleb gave them that. They challenged the chain of custody on the documents. They questioned Fenn's credentials. Despite his 30-year record, they introduced a counter-affidavit from a Helena notary, suggesting the loan document had been properly explained to Caleb at signing. Their best argument was that Caleb, as the signatory, bore responsibility for understanding the terms of an agreement he'd entered. Mace let them finish. Then he said, Let me ask you something, counsel. A man whose wife died 4 days before he signed this document, are we arguing that he was in the optimal condition to parse an acceleration clause buried in paragraph 7 of a 4-page legal instrument? The lawyer said, The law doesn't account for personal. The law accounts for fraud, Mace said, and concealment, and deliberate exploitation of circumstances that the party conducting the transaction had specific knowledge of. He looked at the counter-affidavit. This notary you've cited is Gerald Pruitt. That's correct, Your Honor. Gerald Pruitt, whose name appears as a signatory representative of J.W. Holdings on the original county land filing. A pause. That is, the lawyer started, a conflict of interest, Mace said pleasantly. At minimum. He set the affidavit aside. The lawyer sat down. Caleb kept his face neutral. Beside him, he felt Clara keeping hers neutral also. Under the table, her hand was flat on the edge of the document packet, and he put his hand over hers for exactly 3 seconds, and then moved it back, and she didn't react, except that her shoulders came down about a quarter-inch from where they'd been. Mace deliberated for 40 minutes. In a different court, in a bigger city, this would have been weeks. Here in a county courtroom in Brixton, Montana, where a man's whole life's work was the question on the table, 40 minutes felt both very long and like the most concentrated 40 minutes Caleb had ever lived through. He and Clara sat at the table. Emmett sat behind them. Arthur Fenn sat 2 rows back, reading a document from his case, as if he were in a library. Aldrich sat across the room with his arms folded and his jaw set in the expression of a man experiencing something he hadn't anticipated. At 4:15 in the afternoon, Mace returned. He settled his papers. He looked at the room. He said without prologue, "The court finds in favor of the plaintiff Caleb Dawson of Dawson Ridge Ranch in the matter of Land Note 47-18. He looked at his papers. The acceleration clause as invoked by J.W. Holdings is ruled fraudulent. In its application, the note is declared void in its entirety on grounds of fraudulent inducement, and all associated collateral, including the east pasture, all contiguous structures, and the primary ranch property is confirmed as unencumbered property of the plaintiff." Caleb heard Emmett exhale behind him. "Furthermore," Mace continued, "the court is referring this matter to the Federal Circuit on grounds of interstate fraud. The operations of J.W. Holdings and its associated subsidiary Hargrove Holdings across multiple territories constitute a pattern that exceeds this court's jurisdictional authority to fully address. Federal marshals will be notified." He looked at Whitfield's lawyers. "Counsel, I'd advise your client wherever he is to make himself available." He looked at Hector Harmon's empty chair. "The same advisement applies to Mr. Harmon," he said. "Running tends to confirm rather than resolve suspicion." He gathered his papers. "This court is adjourned." The room moved. People stood, talked, shifted. Whitfield's lawyers were already heads together, and Aldrich was already moving toward the door with the grim purposefulness of a man who needed to have several private conversations immediately. Caleb sat still for a moment. He looked at the table. He looked at the oilcloth package that had traveled from the back room of his house to the Brixton County Recorder to this courtroom table, and had just in the space of one afternoon given him back everything he'd almost lost without knowing it was being taken. Clara was putting the papers away. Her hands were steady. Her face was composed. She was doing the practical thing because doing the practical thing was how she moved through moments that were too large to simply sit in. He watched her. He thought about the stagecoach, the broken wheel, the woman standing with her back to the road, looking at the mountains like she was trying to memorize them, the blood on her hand and the dry eyes, and the question she'd asked him why when he'd offered her water and a chair. He thought about every kitchen table hour since then, every document and every argument and every moment of 2 people figuring out how to stand on the same side of something. He said, "Clara." She looked up. "You asked me once." He said, "To ask you again after the hearing." The room around them was still moving, still loud, but between the 2 of them, the noise didn't quite reach. She set down the papers. "I remember," she said. "The ranch needs someone who knows accounts," he said. "You said that before." "I'm saying it again," he said. "But that's not the reason." She looked at him. "I need—" He stopped, started again. He wasn't a man who found these words easily, and he wasn't going to pretend otherwise. "I've been alone in that house for 3 years, and I'd gotten used to it being the right condition for a man like me. And then you sat down at my kitchen table, and 6 days later, I can't remember what the quiet used to feel like before you were in it." He held her gaze. "I don't know exactly what I'm asking, but I know I'm asking it." Clara looked at him for a long moment. Then she said, "I came to Montana to build something that was mine, something I chose, not something I was placed into." "I know," he said. "Whatever I say yes to, it has to be a choice." "I know that too." She was quiet. The courtroom was emptying around them, and the afternoon light was doing what afternoon light does at the end of things that have been hard and are now finally beginning to resolve. Yes, she said. He looked at her. To staying, she said. To seeing what this is. To the accounts and the ranch and, she paused, to not being alone with whatever comes next. She held his gaze without flinching. But Caleb, if we're doing this, we're doing it honestly. No arrangements, no terms negotiated without me present. No decisions made for me because someone thinks they know what's practical. Never, he said. And I want to teach, she said. There's a school in Millhaven. I still want that. Then we'll figure out how both things are true, he said. Together. She looked at him for another moment. Then she nodded once, the way she nodded when she'd checked a column of figures and found them correct. Emmett appeared at Caleb's shoulder. He looked at both of them. He looked at the table. He picked up the oilcloth package and tucked it under his arm. I'll get the horses, he said. He walked away with the dignified speed of a man who understood the room. Arthur Fenn shook Clara's hand at the courthouse steps with both of his and said, You did the right thing. I'm sorry it took the rest of us longer to get there. And Clara said, Thank you for coming. And Fenn said, I owed you that much, and more. And then he tipped his hat to Caleb and walked to his own hired horse with the quiet purposefulness of a man who had discharged a debt he'd been carrying for years and felt the difference in his posture already. Tolliver came out behind them. He shook Caleb's hand and said, Federal referral means Whitfield's finished. The marshals don't let something like this go. He looked at Clara. That letter you wrote to Mace. He told me it was the clearest statement of intent and accountability he'd read in 20 years on the bench. Those were his words. Clara said, Tell him I appreciate the reading. Tolliver almost smiled. He went back inside. They rode home in the long summer evening, the three of them on the same road they'd taken that morning with the oilcloth package and the weight of what might happen. The weight was different now. It was still there, but it was the weight of something that had been completed, rather than something that was still falling. Caleb rode and thought about the east pasture. He thought about the water access and the cattle and the fence line he'd been repairing alone for weeks. He thought about the account ledger that would now going forward be read by someone who knew how to read it honestly. He thought about the house and the kitchen and Eleanor's chair at the end of the table. He thought about asking Clara at some point, not today, not before she was ready, but at some point if she'd like to sit in it. Not because it was Eleanor's, but because it was a good chair in a good house on a ridge that had just been confirmed by a federal court as belonging to the man who'd built it, and because the woman who'd saved it deserved to sit wherever she wanted. Emmett, riding a half-length ahead, said without turning around, I'm going to need a raise. Caleb said, You're not. I tied up two men's horses, hid documents in a loft, and provided notarized testimony in a fraud case. That's called employment. That's called above and beyond, Clara said without looking up from the road. He's right. He should get a raise. Emmett pointed at her. I like her. You've liked her since she asked about the cattle count, Caleb said. I liked her before that, Emmett said. I liked her when she told you your supply costs were wrong before she'd been in the house an hour. He glanced back. That's a woman who sees clearly. Those are hard to find. Clara said nothing. But Caleb saw the side of her face, and she was doing the thing where she wasn't quite smiling, but the muscles around her mouth had decided something. The ranch came into view as the sun was dropping behind the western ridge. The barn, the house, the fence line, the east pasture, running gold and green in the evening light. The horses smelled home and picked up their pace without being asked. Caleb looked at it. He'd looked at it 10,000 times before. He'd looked at it in grief and in exhaustion, and in the particular blankness of a man who was working to stay moving and nothing more. He'd looked at it and seen Eleanor everywhere, and then looked at it and felt nothing, and both of those had been their own kind of loss. He looked at it now and saw what it was. Land. His land. Work he'd done and work still to do, and a future that had stopped being a thing he was enduring and started being a thing he was choosing. He looked at Clara riding beside him. She caught him looking. What? She said. Nothing, he said. Just looking. She held his gaze for a moment. Then she looked back at the ranch coming toward them in the evening light, and she said very quietly, so only he could hear, "It's a good place." "Yeah," he said, "it is." They rode in. Emmett took the horses. Clara went to the kitchen and started water on the stove with the automatic efficiency of someone who had been doing it long enough that the kitchen felt like a place she belonged. Caleb set the oilcloth package down on the table for the last time, and then moved it to the shelf where it would stay until the federal marshals needed it. And then, after that, it would have served its purpose, and he would put it wherever old documents went when the fight they carried was finished. He sat at the table. Clara moved around the kitchen, and he watched her, and thought about 3 years of sitting in this kitchen alone, and the particular kind of hollow that carves itself into a man when the person he built his life around is gone, and he can't see his way to building it again. He thought about a woman standing with her back to a road looking at mountains, refusing to cry. He thought about the word "we" and the exact moment it had stopped being strange. There were things still to manage the federal referral. Harmon's eventual capture, the formal discharge of the voided loan, the question of Aldrich's other properties on the North Ridge that would now be caught in the federal investigation's net. There were accounts to reconstruct, and fences to finish, and cattle to move, and a school in Millhaven that had a woman's name on a letter of introduction that hadn't been delivered yet, and that would need to be sorted out in whatever way two honest people sorted things out when they'd agreed to figure it out together. But that was tomorrow. Tonight Emmett came in from the barn and sat down, and the three of them ate supper around a kitchen table that had seen the best and worst of the last 10 days, and the conversation was ordinary, practical, small, easy. The kind of conversation that happens between people who have been through something together and have come out the other side and no longer need the experience to announce itself. When they were done and the dishes were cleared, Emmett said goodnight and went to his bunk. Clara stood at the window again, which she did when she was thinking. The summer dark had come down soft, and the stars over the ridge were thick and very bright. "Arthur Fenn," she said. "He'll face scrutiny from the federal investigation." "Probably," Caleb said. "He came anyway." He did. She was quiet for a moment. "People surprise you," she said. "When you've been around enough people who didn't, you start thinking surprise isn't available anymore." Caleb was quiet. "You surprised me," she said. "On the road, when the wheel broke." She turned from the window. "You didn't have to step forward." "You needed help," he said. "People need help all the time," she said. "Most people walk past." He looked at her across the kitchen. This woman who had come off a broken stagecoach with blood on her hand, and terror she refused to show, and a mind like a steel trap, and a moral spine that had been bent for years and had straightened itself through an act of will that most people never manage. This woman who had handed him back his ranch and his future, and without meaning to the particular part of himself he'd fenced off for 3 years and thought was just going to stay that way. "I'm glad the wheel broke," he said. She looked at him. "I'm glad you were on that road," he said. "I'm glad you were headed somewhere that happened to go past my fence line." He paused. "Whatever comes next, however we figure out the teaching and the accounts and the rest of it, I'm glad you're here." Clara Whitmore, who had been precise and practical and controlled for every hour of the 10 days she'd been at Dawson Ridge Ranch, who had built a fraud case from an unopened box of mail and testified before a circuit court judge and faced her father in a yard in the summer heat. Without flinching, looked at him and let the last of the careful distance drop completely. "So am I," she said, and that was the whole of it really. Two people on the same ridge, in the same kitchen, in the same life they'd chosen with their eyes open, and their history carried honestly between them. Some things didn't need more words than that. Caleb Dawson had buried his heart on a winter hillside 3 years ago and learned to live without it. And a woman had arrived on a broken road with blood on her hand and given him, without either of them planning it, a reason to take it back. He intended to keep it this time, and he intended to keep her not as a term in an arrangement, not as a solution to a problem, not as anything other than what she was, a woman who had chosen this ridge and this man and this life out of every possible direction she could have ridden, and who had done it with her eyes open and her accounts balanced and her heart entirely her own. That was the only kind of keeping worth a damn. And on Dawson Ridge in the summer of 1884, that was exactly what they had.